Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Life by Design podcast. On this week's episode, I talk with health and nutrition coach, Ash Boehm. Ash is a certified eating psychology practitioner, master NLP coach, and former personal trainer. On this week's episode, expect to learn why willpower and force isn't the way, the importance of shifting your identity, embodiment, changing your relationship with food, getting out of your head and into your body, and much, much more. Enjoy the episode. Now, guys, before we start this week's episode of the podcast, I want to talk to you about the Life by Design Mastermind. The Life by Design Mastermind is the mastermind for go-getters and high achievers who are looking to create a more successful, fulfilling, and balanced life by design. If you're serious about transforming your life, achieving your goals, and living a life on your terms, then the Life by Design is your golden ticket. Head over to the show notes and click on the link for more details about the program. Ashley Boehm, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Who else calls you Ashley?
My mum, my dad, that's about it. Yeah, or only when I'm naughty. Only when I'm naughty. So
it's a common theme. It's a common theme.
It's Ash.
Ash Boehm.
Ash.
There's a lot for us to talk about today. I'm fascinated in the psychology elements of food, which I know you've spent some time in, and it still blows my mind how this isn't a bigger space.
Yeah.
Continues to blow my mind. So I'm hoping that we get to that today. But before we get started, can you give the guys a 60 to 90 second spiel of who you are and what has got you to where you are today?
Sure. So I am a self-worth and embodiment coach. That is what I go by these days. I've had many, many different iterations of my coaching identity, but this is where I am at the moment, and probably, the one I'm the most proud of. So I started off, I guess, my journey in relation to where I am right now started off from a very young age. I was a child gymnast, so my whole sense of identity and worth was centered around my body and performance. So I was always very externally referenced. And because of that, I then developed a very severe eating disorder from the age of, from about 14 all the way up until almost in my 30s. So 15 years thereabouts. And that was like the whole spectrum of, anorexia, bulimia, binge eating, body dysmorphia, everything you can imagine I was experiencing at some point. So I've always had this really tumultuous relationship with my body, yet was always sourcing all my worth through it as well. So it was like this love-hate thing. And I had a big spiritual awakening around my Saturn return. Goes to, stands to reason. Went to the jungle, did a shitload of plant medicine, and had this massive experience, and really saw everything for what it was, and started to connect to my true essence beyond my physical form. And that sort of started my personal development journey. And, then went on to study NLP. So I'm a master NLP coach and also a psychology of eating practitioner. And those are kind of like the two realms that I work in. So I guess my goal and my ambition today is to enable women to create like this beautiful cohesion and coherence between the physical and the non-physical aspects of themselves. So, yeah.
That's succinct. Identity, the three areas that you play in as a witness, I guess, I think are three heavily underrated areas. One, obviously, we spoke about right at the start, the psychology and the emotional eating components. Two, self-worth, and three, identity.
Yep.
I'm going to start with identity because I love this space and I think it's heavily underrated. What's the significance of identity when it comes to change?
Well, identity pretty much informs everything. So our identity informs our values and informs our beliefs, which then informs our thoughts and emotions and our behavior. So the identity sits at the actual core of who we are, and we will always behave in alignment with the identity that we're the most strongly associated with. So this is what I was noticing. I was a personal trainer. I forgot to mention that for many, many, many years, working with women to try and help them become empowered, but I was actually probably damaging them more than anything. But what I was noticing and what I came to realize is I was trying to create all this behavioral level change, helping people to try and change who they saw themselves as, or their identity through changing their physical body. But inevitably, they would always revert back. They would always regain their weight because there had been nothing change on the identity level. They still viewed themselves as the funny fat girl or, whatever the identity was associated with the physical body. So I would always get so frustrated as to why they couldn't seem to sustain sustain it. But it was only until I did, started to understand identity psychology that I realized that the identity shift needs to happen first in order for any other level of change to be really solidified and consistent and sustainable, I guess, in the long term. So, yeah, I think we will always behave like the person we perceive ourselves to be or who we believe that we are.
What are your thoughts? I've had some really interesting conversations around this, and I'm more called to your train of thought in terms of identity first and behaviors, or behaviors then identity. Have you seen it work the other way in terms of changing behaviors, and because of that, there's a shift in identity? But I'm assuming the stronger approach is an identity shift first.
Oh, it is the fast track. So it's basically like you can take the fast lane or the slow lane. To change your identity through behaviors it feels like more of a force and more of a willpower journey sort of situation, where it's like you have to actively flex a lot of willpower. A lot of people, if you've got a strong sense of willpower and you're a pretty stubborn person, you can succeed because, the result off the back of the behavior will then provide that feedback that the identity is, becoming embodied. But a lot of people don't have that kind of, that willpower and I guess the ability to sustain that level of grit and force against an identity, because what you're doing is you're behaving like someone that you're not. And that creates so much, I guess, cognitive dissonance and misalignment, and it feels like a struggle a lot of the time. So some people will be able to do it, many people won't, which is why I often work on both levels at the same time. So you don't have to just do one first and the other. Sometimes you can do them both at the same time, because the behavior will reinforce the identity of who they're becoming more so. Yeah. So you can do it, but I mean, it's not as pleasant or straightforward.
What have you noticed about so if you look at your own journey, which I think we kind of came into each other's world about 3 years ago, what have you noticed in terms of your own evolution over, like if we kind of micro in on the last 3 years, what identity shifts have you gone through yourself, just so people have context for how that might look?
Yeah, God, it's been a really wild one. I think when we first met, I was transitioning out of very traditional kind of nutrition, PT kind of business model into the psychology of eating one that I am kind of associated with now. And that was like a really crazy shift for me. It took me a while to build up the courage to do that, because I'd built so much of an identity around being this like fit chick, like I was always posting fitness content and always being really inspirational. I think that was like the mask that I really wore, was this girl who had it all together, who was really confident, really strong, bit of tough love, quite sassy, I think I was very head-based as well, not just ego, but I think I was quite disembodied. Even though I looked very physical, it doesn't mean I was embodied. I was still very separate. My body was like a vehicle sort of situation. It wasn't like, I didn't feel like it was part of me. I felt like it was separate to me. And so now I think through my journey, I've been bitch slapped by the universe a few times, humbled a lot. I've had some experiences that have flipped me inside out and really softened me, and also like really removed that desire to be viewed in a certain way. Like I'm much, much more open and vulnerable these days. And, I don't position myself as much of, I guess, as this inspirational character, more so somebody who's just trying to figure it out myself and maybe has some information that I can share to help inspire. So I've really taken myself down off a pedestal, which has been really nice and refreshing. So as far as like, I'm kind of in this bit of a cross-section at the moment of who I'm stepping into. So it's probably not a great time to be in a bit of a identity crisis. But when I say identity crisis, it's not necessarily like a negative thing for me, because for me, when I'm stepping into a new identity, I'm shedding layers of things that are not really me, that are conditioning or masks or roles that I've played to get me through that period of life. And, more of my true essence starts to come out. So I'm kind of still figuring out what that looks like now. And yeah, I think it's more of archetypally, I'm really starting to feel like I'm finally growing into the queen. I was very much in that princess era being very self-focused, very trying to figure it out, very trying to discover who I am, and still very externally referenced. And then as we graduate more into a queen, as we get closer to 40s and 50s, really that's when we can start to like really claim that archetype. I'm becoming more about service and being more outwardly focused and making it less about myself, I suppose. And I'm even starting, we spoke really briefly, I'm on a bit of a fertility journey at the moment. So I'm starting to really step into the mother archetype and bringing forth all those qualities. So it's like a little bit of a work in progress, but I feel like there's been a huge amount of maturity over the period of time that we've known each other, and just a massive, I guess, softening in that image and that exterior and that desire to be seen a certain way. Like I'm not really concerned about how I'm seen so much these days, which is good, which is really good.
That does make life a lot easier.
Yeah.
What you spoke of it in a very grounded way of like, I'm still trying to make sense of my new identity, which because you have the tools and understanding, that kind of resonates with you. But for a lot of people, that's like fucking World War III when they a shift in their identity. So what does a shift in identity look like, and what's the, I guess, challenging components of a identity crisis or a shift in identity that a lot of people might not even be aware of?
So an identity crisis often feels like some people can live their entire life in an identity crisis, by the way, like massively. And that's when we're so a kind of a product of our environment and our conditioning that we have no idea who we are. We have no idea what our preferences are. We're choosing the wrong partners. We're just falling into jobs that, we don't really love, but we don't really know what else we want to do. It's kind of like this living at at effect kind of situation, not cause, the other way around. So a lot of people actually exist like that. And I think that you probably, majority of my clients come to me because of that feeling. But if you're someone who's, been cycling through quite strong identities, having an identity crisis feels like, I like to describe it like a tower moment, which is like, with the tarot cards, there's a card called the Tower. Whenever I get the Tower in my readings, I'm always like, oh God. So what it represents, the card is like this image of this burning building, and there's people like jumping out. It's like this chaotic feeling of destruction and just complete, chaos. But off the back of that, there's renewal and regeneration and starting fresh. So it can be like this feeling of everything that you believe to be true and correct, and your beliefs and your paradigms and even your relationships. It's like this massive questioning and this massive tearing down of everything that feels solid in your life. And it just feels like this big empty void. And you're sort of just like floating there in space going, it's like, and also I like to describe it, there's like too many metaphors that are going on at the moment, but it's like walking through this dark hallway, like you close one door behind you, which is your old self, and you can't yet see the next door, and you're just walking and you don't know what it looks like or what it feels like. And it can be a really scary feeling, and it does feel like a void. So because what you once knew to be true and what everything that felt safe to you and certain no longer exists, but there's nothing in its replacement yet. So it can be this really eerie feeling. But it can look like people will often like leave relationships or change careers, have like big life events that can create a big identity shift, or it can be like a planetary thing, that also happens. But yeah, or it can just come out of nowhere. People can just wake up one day and have an experience that really illuminates like the way that they've been living and how out of alignment it is with who they really think they are. So yeah, it can be a pretty full on and destabilizing experience when it's happening, for sure. Just because I'm like smiling while I'm talking about it doesn't mean that I haven't experienced all these things recently. Yeah.
What's your suggestion, both as a individual who might be going through it and potentially, friends, families, partners that might bear witness to it? And the reason I say that is, fuck, my shift in identity and my, dark night of the soul and everything else that kind of came at the same time was gnarly. And had someone told me what I was going through, I would have been in a lot better place. But whether no one knew or no one told me, it was like 20 times scarier because I had no idea what the fuck was going on. So how would you help someone navigate that shift?
Yeah, for sure. I think having like a really solid practice of self-awareness, so something like a journaling practice, a ritual that enables you to connect in deeply on a regular basis, and knowing how to ask yourself the right questions to navigate it. Also having a really effective somatic toolbox is really important, because often when we're going through these really like scary phases and sitting in these liminal spaces and everything feels like it's falling to pieces and we're seeing the most horrendous aspects of ourselves for the first time, it can bring up a lot of emotion. And if we don't know how to be with that emotion and don't know how to be with that physical discomfort, then we will usually either try and suppress it, which then prolongs that experience of being in that space, or we will turn to vices like alcohol, food, sex, like even relationships. We'll try and, offload that somewhere, or we can, start to become quite destructive. So I think having a connection with your body and with your unconscious mind or subconscious through any kind of practices, meditation, definitely somatic exercises to be able to really experience all the uncomfortable emotions that arise. Because often in these places as well, we start to relive old events that we've suppressed because there's like this big open wound sort of situation or this big open space, and everything that we've been pushing to the side and ignoring kind of starts to fill that space. And if we don't have the tools to be able to really process it, then it just gets pushed aside again and it compounds for the next time and becomes increasingly more intense and also starts to leak out into our behaviors. So, yeah.
You spoke briefly there of like the importance of the embodiment and connection to self. And by your own admission, you kind of mentioned earlier that you were, and as someone who's kind of been in your world for 3 years, I can definitely attest to that. Someone who spent a lot of time in their head, and that's been a practice of yours over the last 3 years. What does embodiment mean, and how would someone know whether they're embodied or not? And what are some of the things that they might start to do to reconnect into their body a little more?
Yeah, so a lack of embodiment, there's so many ways that it can kind of manifest. So it can be, like feeling like you're living life through the head. So even having like a mental experience of your emotions. So a lot of people will try and process an emotional experience through the mind and logic their way out of it or think their way out of it, as opposed to really feel it through the body and allow the emotional wave to take place, or just to actually tune into it. So it can be like things like emotional suppressing and putting the emotion through the brain, through the mind instead of the body. It can be like emotional numbness, so completely cut off from the experience of having, an emotional experience in the body. People who are chronic dieters, people who count macros, people who do all that stuff are really funny with food. Always disembodiment. That's always a sign of disembodiment, because you're externalizing something that is a very physical experience, which is eating, hunger and fullness. Everything can be done through the body. You don't need any of that stuff. But when there's a lack of embodiment, there's a lack of trust in the body. And so everything needs to be controlled through the mind. Lack of sexual pleasure or desire for pleasure. So people who are really cut off from their sexuality or really ashamed of sexuality, that's a form of disembodiment as well. A lot of lack of intuition. So people who, again, can't trust their own inherent body wisdom and the guidance and the kind of messages that come through. So again, overanalyzing, overthinking, and that can feel like living in a state of chronic fear and anxiety, because the body knows there's so much wisdom there. There's so much wisdom. And we were talking about this just before we jumped on, about how much unconscious information we are absorbing through our environment and the people in our environment that we can't consciously process, but then that gets communicated through body signals. And that's what intuition is. It's really the unconscious mind taking in so much information that we're not really realizing, and then feeding that through to us through the body. And if you're cut off from your body, if you're living life in your head, you don't get any of that. So then you're trying to analyze and make decisions based off the limited amount of information that you've absorbed through your conscious mind. And you don't get all this juicy info that's actually sitting there waiting for you to access it. So, and it creates so much anxiety and just like a lack of trust in self and life, and a lack of ability to surrender. So it's like this real contracted state of being, so to speak. So there's some very physical symptoms, as in not having much sensation, not having any connection to exercise, or over exercising, so abusing the body with exercise or trying to control it. But then sometimes it's just doing everything through the mind and over analyzing.
What have you noticed in your own personal experience, whether it's relating, food, exercise, connection, sexuality, any of those kind of areas that you mentioned? What have you noticed the difference for you over the last 3 years as you've become more embodied?
Well, my relationship with food is definitely the best it's ever been. And I think the more I sink into this body work, the even more love I fall in with food. It was always such a huge pain point for me. And even, not that long ago, maybe even when we met, I still had a great relationship with it to a certain degree, way better than I'd ever had. But there was almost an overcompensation there where I was like, couldn't get enough, or I was like overeating a lot and then having to over exercise because I was just so in love with food and I had all these no rules now. So that the food stuff for me is just like pure pleasure, pure joy, no restrictions. But I treat my body like I love it deeply. And I think that's been the thing for me, is like loving my body to the level that I will only ever treat it in a way that feels good. And that's not always like healthy. That's like, I can be drinking sometimes and everything like that. But yeah, so food and exercise has changed dramatically. Only ever make loving choices there. I ask myself every single day, what's the most loving choice in regards to how I want to move today or how I want to eat? Even like sexually, like being way more connected. Another thing, that used to be something that I would do often would be fake orgasms, which is something that I think a lot of women actually do, but they don't say it because they don't want to insult the men in their life, which is fair enough, but it does happen. And that's because we don't value our own pleasure, or we're more concerned about other people's physical experience than our own. And we don't even have much of a desire to connect to it. So sexuality changes, sex has changed massively. And just like, I used to have this big thing about body image, and like I was always working on my body image and how I viewed my body. And that was a big piece of work that I did. But now I've kind of flipped that as embodiment is like the cure for body image. Because when you stop needing to look good to feel good, and you utilize your body as a vehicle to experience life, it doesn't matter what it looks like. Like the image in your mind makes so much less, or has so much less impact than it does like what your physical experience of your body is, if that makes sense. So it's like body image can be really, really worked at from an angle of like learning to experience the body as like an experience of life and expression and pleasure and joy and fun and adventure, as opposed to even caring about what it needs to look like. So yeah, it's been a really interesting journey, and one that I think has touched so many areas of my life that I didn't really expect it to. Yeah.
What do you, so obviously you've been in the health and fitness game for a long time, and as you said, kind of looking at whether it's health and fitness or just personal development or growth in a very different set of lenses over the last 3 years in particular. How has your relationship with food changed, and how do you see the space of nutrition now that you have a deeper understanding of the emotional components, the psychological components? How, in an ideal Ash Boehm world of people and food, how would it go? How would it look different?
Yeah. I feel like I was having this discussion with a client the other day who is in a similar field, like the kind of food freedom sort of field. And I feel like there's been like this big dichotomy where it's like dieting and macros and the fitness industry, and then this anti-diet kind of movement as well, where it's like nobody should diet, it's bad for you and it's really bad for your mental health. And I really don't fit in with either of those camps. Like I really believe that, like one of my programs is called Eat Like You Love Yourself. Like if you ran that through your filter every single day, like what would eating like I love myself look like, then I feel like that would just completely absolve all food and body challenges, really. Because yeah, the diet industry and the fitness industry has really warped people's sense of their ability to trust themselves, and really attached people to unrealistic ideals and body images that are they're not meant for them. They're never made for them. And I think that's kind of like really distorted, people's idea around how they should look and what they should look like. But then also the anti-diet movement, I don't think is doing much for anyone either, because it's demonizing people who want to be healthy. And look, I can't get on board with the fact that, being morbidly obese is in any way healthy. And I'm probably going to get shamed for that as well, for saying that. But I mean, yeah, I think embodied eating and eating according to your needs and what you know to be good for you, and introducing pleasure and variety, like that's literally how simple it is. It doesn't need to be any more complicated than that, but somehow it has become that way. What
did you go through, or what are you still even going through, just so people can understand what that journey looks like when it came to, macros and, whatever kind of schools of thought you followed when it came to nutrition? What's that process been like for you as you've let go of labels, identities, certain diets, and you've like tuned into what feels good for you? And what does that look like now? Are you waiting till you're hungry? Like how does that look on a daily basis for you personally?
Yeah. So the way I approach it is masculine and feminine, right? So the balance, always, always, always. You can't be too much in one. So the traditional diet system is very masculine, rigid, numbers, rules, structure, sameness all the time. And the anti-diet movement is almost like the feminine in the extreme, which is pleasure, chaos, joy, emotion, just all no structure whatsoever. So the way that I do it, and I think this is just, the way that we need to be living life is balance, is I have foundational habits that don't move. That's the framework. These are my non-negotiables. It's how much water I drink. It's how much protein I get in every day because I'm an active woman, very important. Like certain, very broad levels of carbohydrates and fats. And I just know intuitively, and also from my knowledge, obviously I have a lot of information around this, of what works. So those are non-negotiables. And then the pleasure and the feminine comes in when I choose exactly what sources of protein, what spices, what kind of little snacks or treats. So there's a certain level of variety, but the framework stays pretty consistent. My meals are generally the same size because, again, I just know myself so well. But if I'm hungry, I eat. If I'm not hungry, I don't. I'm never not listening to it. If I get 3/4 through the way of my meal and I'm unusually full, then I stop. It's all using introspective awareness. So I set my diet up to be fairly consistent because the body loves rhythm as well. So everything in nature moves in rhythmic cycles and we are absolutely no different. So the more consistent and rhythmic we can become, the more the body starts to thrive within that because it's predictable and it knows what's happening and energy stabilizes. So everything starts to function really well. So there's a lot of rhythm, but there's still a lot of joy, and I leave room for spontaneity and pleasure. And, I don't always just say yes, I have a healthy relationship with no. Something that was a beautiful reframe for me was, having eating disorder my whole life, this word discipline had this really negative context for me and really negative kind of energy to it because I was too disciplined, ridiculously disciplined. So I kind of had to really let that word go out of my vocabulary until I brought it back in recently. And discipline is essentially, when you break it down, it's a disciple. So when you're disciplined, I'm a disciple of my highest good. So I'm disciplined in the way that I eat in the context of I'm a disciple for what's best for me. And that can look the same or it can look different. I just know what that means because I have a good relationship with myself. So sometimes I say yes, sometimes I say no, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with either one of those.
What have you found as the challenges? I would only assume, and maybe I shouldn't assume, that it didn't naturally just sort itself overnight. There might have been head noise. Did you find yourself in a dance between, potentially the head noise, the old stories, the old identity, and really tuning into your body? What are some of the challenges that you faced in that dynamic?
So it was quite interesting because for years and years and years, this was an uphill battle, and this was a very much an identity thing. I realized all of my food and body behaviors served to uphold the identity. So I was trying to let go of all these, but I hadn't done the identity change. So how could I let go of the behaviors when I needed the behaviors to uphold the identity? So that literally was my struggle. So there was an identity shift that needed to take place at the same time, but there was skills that I didn't know how to do. I had no introspective awareness. I didn't know what hungry or full was because I was so used to being so hungry and then binge eating so full that I had no idea what that felt like. So I had to literally reteach my body I had to reteach myself how to stop at a certain level of fullness because I didn't know how to do that. And same with hunger, I'd get off on being really, really hungry. So I had to learn to eat when I was just a comfortable hunger. So there was a lot of skill development, but there was a lot of identity work at the same time because I had to really start to develop habits that would uphold a new identity. So I had to figure out who that was as well and what habits were supported or what these habits supported. But yeah, there was another interesting thing, and I spoke about this. I did this free masterclass recently about how it's a Carl Jung quote, and he says, "We don't solve our problems, we outgrow them." And what I found is I just got to this point of my life where I outgrew the need to look a certain way. I was developing spiritually so much and I guess emotionally and mentally that the problem of gaining a little bit of weight was nowhere near as big as my other problems. It was kind of a small problem now. So the more I grew as a woman and the more I grew as a human, the more insignificant the things that I used to freak out about came. And so it was kind of also a pretty easeful progression when I started focusing on bigger shit that was like more problematic. So I just attracted bigger problems essentially. So I really, it was like this beautiful cohesion of like teaching myself the skills of how to uphold this new identity, because I couldn't do them separately, one or the other. So I couldn't embody the new identity with also like just learning how the practicality of how to eat without following a meal plan or macros, or like having to like, restrict or put all these rules on myself. But it was definitely the personal development journey was the thing that really pulled me out of it massively.
If you look at I guess these three underlying themes of self-worth, identity, and I guess the kind of psychology, and someone, in this moment's identifying that potentially they don't have the best relationship with food, welcome to society. Most people probably feel the same as you. Like, where does someone even start? They've obviously brought awareness to the fact that, okay, this isn't necessarily serving me. I don't have the best relationship. Like, where would you suggest someone start, as well as coming and working with you directly, which is obvious, which is an obvious answer.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the core questions to ask, and this is a big piece of self-inquiry and something that people don't really look at, is looking at how like food serves as a doorway to a greater piece of healing and a greater problem, because food is a symbolic substitute for something else that we're not getting. So when we're overeating or we're binge eating or we're emotional eating, there's a need that's going unmet that food is filling the space. So it's like, where are my needs going unmet? And even controlling, like usually we exert so much external control when we have so much internal chaos. So it's almost like a balancing act. So I guess the first question to ask is like, how is this a mirror for something else in my life or an unmet need? And how can I first start to address the needs that are being unmet, or potentially the internal sense of chaos or disempowerment that I'm projecting onto my body, and just start from there as well, because you'll never be able to let go of the food stuff until the other needs are being met or everything else is taken care of. But certainly getting some guidance around it. And I don't just say that because it's what I do and I'm trying to self-promote, but it is so hard because this is not just a mental thing, it's like a body thing. There's a certain level of addiction to these behaviors, and there's a certain physical response that happens and a physical hook with eating behaviors, whether it even be restriction or overeating or binge eating. So having the guidance and someone to actually teach you how to manage it from a very physical level and also nourish yourself is really important. Support is so important because it's so, unlike drugs and alcohol, like food, we have to interact with every single day. Otherwise we die. Like you can't go cold turkey on it. So if you have this distorted relationship with food, you are literally meeting your enemy and your source of stress like several times throughout the day. And that is such a drain on your life force to be in this battle and to be consumed by it. Like it is such a distraction from who you're meant to be in the world and who you could be and your potential and your possibility, and all that energy that you are utilizing dealing with your food issues or even being ashamed about them could be funneled into other things that is going to bring you so much joy and pleasure. So I think, number one, just acknowledge how food is a symbolic substitute for something you're not getting and work with trying to, deal with those issues. But definitely get some help because it's a very skill-based thing as well to learn how to do this. Yeah.
And one of the things that you spoke of there, which I don't want to underestimate the impact of it, is so right at the start, we spoke about force and willpower, and that being a avenue that so many people take when it comes to like, I need to force myself to eat healthier. I need to have more willpower to overcome. But exactly as you said, that force and willpower through behaviors alone without an identity shift really does drain your life force. It doesn't have to be that hard.
No, it doesn't. I mean, so initially when you start to do this work, it may feel a lot more painful. It's like more of an acute pain because you're addressing all this stuff that you've been hiding from through your food and body issues. And like when you're focusing on your body all the time, like you don't have to focus on a heap of other shit. So it may be this like intense pain, but then it's way better as opposed to this constant trying to change yourself from the outside in and ignoring the internal work. So it's like you're either choosing, an acute short-term pain and dealing with all your stuff, or you're facing a lifetime of battling against yourself and trying to slug it out and hopefully get there in the end. But yeah, so it's kind of like pick your pain. I know which one that I would prefer. But yeah, the willpower thing, I mean, it just drains your energy. And also there is a difference between forcing and pushing yourself into something as opposed to lovingly guiding yourself through a process. And just whenever you're doing something from a place of force, it just never, ever works out well. It's not a loving energy.
Beautiful. Smash, if people want to find out more about you, the work you do, and they want to get on top of their life from an identity, self-worth, and potentially eating point of view as well, where do they find out?
The best place to find me is on Instagram. My handle is I am Ashley Boehm. That's Boehm, and Ashley with an Leigh. So yeah, touch base with me on there. You can check out all my various offerings via my Insta, and feel free to slide into the DMs and connect. Always open for a chat.
Beautiful. Awesome, Ash. Appreciate you jumping on and sharing all your wisdom and insights.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.